Our first speaker is a pioneer in human interface technology. He has served a combined 23 years as a U.S. Air Force officer and civilian at the Armstrong Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where he developed advanced cockpits and virtual interfaces for the Department of Defense. He has been coined the grandfather of virtual reality and is here to talk to you about being the future. Please join me in welcoming Tom Furness to the stage.
Hi, Tom. Okay, thank you. Morning, everyone.
Good morning. Oh, hi, Tom.
Augie.
Tom.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see you. Don't worry, I won't keep you for long.
Okay,
I know you're a busy man.
How are you doing?
I'm very good.
Have you had breakfast?
I've had a virtual breakfast.
Oh, really? You don't
not quite as
need
filling.
food? They feed you electrons?
But as you know, I do get messages from devices that you've had a personal history with. But I do need your help to understand the visions that I get. Are you willing to do that for me?
Oh, sure.
Well, because there's a lot of voices. There really are. Let's face it. You've got a personal history with a lot of digital devices. It's like a cacophony out there. It's a lot of noise. But I want everybody here to help, actually, to help focus the mind. So can I ask you, Tom, and everybody, I want everybody to close their eyes. Close your eyes and take a deep breath. That's it. Fill your blood with oxygen and find a still point in your mind. The signals that I listen for are as weak as brainwaves, but they're as strong as your will. Oh, no, I've got something. You can open your eyes now. I've got something. It's calling me. It's a young voice, yeah? It's a loud ringtone. Oh, it's a precocious little bugger. No, it's your cell phone. Your cell phone's talking to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, it wants to say, sorry for interrupting you so often, first of all. It's saying there's something been calling you, trying to call you for years, like a special project or a perennial question that's been haunting you. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Resonance, coherence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go with that. Your phone is saying that you take so many calls from so many people that sometimes this more important call, this calling, if you like, is having trouble getting through.
Oh.
And now this is ironic because it's so precocious. It's saying it hopes you'll turn it off more often because then you'll be able to turn up that volume on that still voice. Now, I don't know if that makes any sense. Makes none to me whatsoever. Does that speak to you in any way?
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm going to use that still voice the whole time here.
Well, that's great. Well, it's sending you a smiley, so that's nice. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I give you Tom Furness.
Thank you, Augie. Morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and wonderful that you can be sharing breakfast while I'm doing this. So, being the future, what in the world does that mean? Well, I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I'd like to sort of start at the beginning, at least my beginning. As it turns out, in the 60s, there were sort of three guys. There was Mort Heilig and Ivan Sutherland and this brand new second lieutenant, Tom Furness, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, of course, Heilig and Sutherland were sort of older guys, and Furness was this fresh kid on the street. And what happened, of course, is that we all had visions and dreams. In the case of Mort Heilig, Mort was really trying to solve the problem of how do we get an experience which is greater than just watching a movie. How could you actually be in the movie? And how could you have more stimulation in the eyes and the ears? For example, vibration, wind blowing on your face, smells, things like that. He set about building the Sensorama. You'll probably heard about this. And he was quite a pioneer in that work. He was really just a filmmaker, but he wanted to have this greater experience. Now, Ivan Sutherland the same way. He'd been staring at computer screens for years, and he said, I want to get into the screen. I want to break the glass. Is there any way that I can do that? And he started working on what we now call today the ultimate interface, or what we also call virtual reality, where he was using this computer graphics capability with a head-mounted display to show things in 3D. They're really simple because of the computational capabilities we had at the time. And so these two guys were pretty much working on the push. They saw this thing that they could probably do, and they wanted to do it. Now, in my case, it was something else. We were in the middle of a war, and I was going to be drafted, so I decided to go in the Air Force. That's probably the best way to go to war, in the Air Force. And so my job was, how in the world do we interface humans with machines? And so basically, this was the kind of machine that I was working on, where you had one pilot interfacing with that. And there were a lot of problems. In the case of the F-15 cockpit, there were lots of switches, lots of displays. And we did evolve that using new technology from what you see here in 1972 to 1988, when we went to more electronic displays. And we thought we were making progress, but it turns out we weren't really. We were actually making it more complex, more difficult for the pilot to form a mission. So we had this reality of this human connected to this machine in a very dynamic environment where things were happening all around, and these crew members were trying to deliver energy from one place to another. And with these particular workstations, it was very difficult to get bandwidth to and from the brain in order to accomplish that. So there are really 4 problems, among others, that I started looking at. That was my job. Figure out how to solve these problems. One is that we were aiming the airplane in order to aim all the systems on the airplane. We also had this problem of seeing at night. We had these marvelous sensors that would let us look into the nighttime. But our cockpits were so jammed with instruments, we didn't have enough space to put in a display so we could even see what's coming from the sensors. We had also this problem of complexity. Here we had an aircraft that had 50 computers on board and 1 operator. And how in the world were we going to make sense of that? And how is this one human going to operate all those computers? And then there was this whole deal that you had the outside in and inside out. There was a world out there that you needed to tend to, but all the instruments in the cockpit. So you had to move in and out in order to make sense of things. So those were the problems I was trying to solve. So early on, I decided, we got to do a paradigm shift. We got to do this differently. So I started working on, and not long after I arrived at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, on different ways of representing information. This whole business of small displays, well, I discovered, why don't we just take something as small and make it appear to be big and project it as a virtual image? So you see here is sort of the world's first helmet-mounted display that does a virtual image projection. And here's Lieutenant Furness wearing that very first helmet-mounted display. Then there was the aiming problem. Here we were aiming the airplane in order to aim all the systems on the airplane. Well, I said, well, can't the pilot really see the target out there? Isn't that good enough? So we started working on a way to take the helmet position of that crew member and use it to aim the systems on the aircraft. And here you see the world's first helmet-mounted sight in 1969 with Lieutenant Furness wearing that. And of course, the whole idea was to put these into real airplanes and test them, in which we did. And we found that, one of the cool things is, what if we put the two together? What if we put the helmet sight and helmet display together? Now what we would have is this virtual image that can move around wherever we want to, but we always know where it is by using the tracking system. So you see in 1971, this virtual, what we call a visually coupled system. So this let us move those sensors outside the aircraft wherever we're moving our head, but at the same time getting the visual scene. So it was just like a picture window we cut in the cockpit. This huge picture that we could move around and basically get rid of the obstructions of the cockpit. This was remarkable, transformational. Now, there was this problem also of complexity. Here we have this aircraft, in case of an F-16 aircraft, Falcon. There are about 50 computers on board. You have a computer for digital fly-by-wire, for aid data, for stability augmentation, for your electronic intelligence stuff. And the problem is, if this airplane is just sort of inherently unstable, if you lose the power in the main bus of your aircraft, it just isn't going to be a good day. And you have to leave the office really fast because it just isn't going to work out for you. So I had to go to work on how in the world do we solve this bandwidth between the human and the machine. And that's when we came up with this idea of a super cockpit, a cockpit that you wear, that basically provides a circumambience of three-dimensional information to the human. But we had to sort of test this idea, and how would that work? And this is where we really got deep into virtuality. It turns out that virtual worlds are there along with the real world. And they're reflections. They're things that appear in space that aren't really there, but we can interact with them as if they are there. And so harnessing this idea, making accessible this notion of virtuality, was what propelled us into this super cockpit. But we had to build a simulator. Now, some of you may have seen this photograph before. This is my so-called Darth Vader helmet. I started building this in the late 70s, and we turned it on the first time in 1981. It was amazing. 120-degree field of view, binocular, a 16-bit tracking system, speech input, eye tracking, all these kinds of things that we were working on in this time. And so we were able to explore how in the world do we organize and put this virtual cockpit, this virtual information together and take advantage of it. But one of the things we discovered in the process of using this device is, oh my goodness, what have we created? Because we found now it was like in an IMAX theater where you could look around. And we found that instead of looking at a screen that was a head-mounted screen, it was like we were pulled inside into another world. This transformation was remarkable. And when we did that, those three-dimensional abilities that we use in the real world, we could actually now use in this computer-generated world, which meant that we had much more power and much more bandwidth to and from the brain and our psychomotor capabilities. So, the Darth Vader helmet propelled us into the super cockpit. And the super cockpit was basically taking all of these things and using new devices, new technologies. At the time, we were using miniature cathode ray tubes. You had 15 kilovolts sitting on the side of your helmet, projecting all these electrons on the screens and things like that. But it was amazing what we were getting into holographic optics and things like that. So here's an artist's rendering of this so-called super cockpit. And the whole idea is to transform what you see in a normal cockpit with 300 switches and 75 displays, and 11 switches on the control stick, and 9 switches on the throttle. And you're flying twice the speed of sound, pulling G's to the boundaries of consciousness, and being shot at the same time. That's sort of a busy workplace. And one guy told me, he said, gosh, that sounded like a standard day in New York City to me. But nevertheless, this is the problem we were trying to solve. So here we see a traditional, this is an F-18 cockpit actually, and all these displays, all this information. You push one button, the whole display changes to another set of symbols. So you have a vertical situation display, a horizontal situation display, a radar display, a stores management display. You have all your navigation systems and things like that. And it's just overwhelming. Pilots complained that their brains would ooze out of their fingertips because they couldn't remember what mode they were in. And those switches on the control stick, they change what they do depending upon what mode you're in. So that was the problem. So what we were able to do then is take this information that was all discrete and separated and highly coded and basically build a fused display, a mimetic display. It's something that would give the pilot a gestalt to get an understanding of everything that was going on in the world at the same time. A fusion of your air data information, of your threat information, of your navigation, all these kind of things were projected in one-to-one registration with the real world. If you're flying at night, you'd see this picture. If you're flying in the daylight, you would actually see the outside world with some of this information superimposed on top of it. So it was a fusion between VR and AR that would allow us to do this. And this was, of course, the concept that we were trying to work on. So this paradigm shift also let us deal with this outside in and inside out problem. Here we need to have a sort of an overview of what's going in the world. Even though we're in this instantaneous part of the world, this location of the world, we had to be able to know what's going on around us. So we had this so-called exocentric display. The egocentric display is when we're looking on the inside out. The exocentric display is when we're looking on the outside in. And the whole idea then is to have this so-called God's eye view that would let us interact with this overview. And when we did that, for example, we put our finger into the God's eye display and say, what is that? And this laser line would come out of your finger, a virtual laser line would come out of your finger and go in the outside world, and you see where that is. Or you would say, you would look at this and say, what is that? And come down into your God's eye display and where that is relative to others. And you touch these different objects in the God's eye display to communicate with them through secure communications and things like that. So this was all being looked at and advanced when we're using this Darth Vader simulation helmet. And of course, then the issue was to translate that into real equipment that would be used in the actual aircraft. So I did this for 23 years at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We were advancing the state-of-the-art measurement. And of course, it was nice to have a big budget. It was easier to do it with a defense budget to do these kinds of things. I don't know how much I cost the taxpayers, but it was in the hundreds of millions to work on this stuff. But it was wonderful and exciting and wonderful teams to put this kind of technology together. But in 1989, I decided to make a shift in the way I was doing things. There was a news cast that was done on CBS, probably in 1986 or something like that. And CBS Evening News with Dan Rather and David Martin, the Pentagon correspondent, and this film crew came out to Wright-Patterson to film some of the declassified stuff I was doing with this virtual cockpit. And so this film crew spent 2 days in my lab, and I showed them around and how things were working. So I ended up on the CBS Evening News and talking about this virtual cockpit. Oh my goodness, that changed my life. Now, instead of being a military research kind of guy, I was in the show business. And everybody started coming to Wright-Patterson. The generals were coming. And anybody that flew over Ohio, I'm convinced, came to my lab to see this thing. And so it became quite a phenomenon. But as a result of that, I was writing articles for Popular Mechanics. We're on the front page of U.S. News and Report. The science editor in the New York Times came down and spent a day with me. And they said, wow, this is so cool stuff. But the most remarkable thing was the phone calls I started getting. This mother called me and said, you know, I saw this program on television, and my child has cerebral palsy. Is there anything you can do with that technology to help my child? A surgeon called me. He was a thoracic surgeon. He was trying to do a transplant of the aorta, a graft of the aorta. And he says, is there any way you can sort of help me with navigating inside the body? You know, I have all this information on a CT scan, but it's on a light box on the wall. Is there any way you can project that into the patient so I can find my way around? Or another surgeon said, I want to be on the inside looking out. Can you put my eyes inside the patient so I can do this? Firefighting company called me and said, you know, we have this real problem with firefighters. We're going into these buildings full of smoke. They don't know if there are any people in the building. They don't even know where the fire is. And oh, by the way, the guy's telling them what to do is the fire chief. He's on the outside of the building on a radio, and he doesn't know anything. Is there any way you can solve those problems? And I was getting phone calls, 3 or 4 phone calls a week from people thinking about this application of this technology. And I started thinking about this, and I said, wow, you know, the answer to all of their questions, well, yeah, we could do that. As a matter of fact, that'd be sort of easy to do compared to what I'm trying to do. And I realized, you know, we need to get this out of the military. We need to get this technology out in the world where it can really do some good. And so I decided to beat my sword into Plowshare. In 1989, I moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to start a lab at the University of Washington. And that became the Human Interface Technology Lab. I wanted to build upon all we had learned, and we'd learned a lot. I spent $1 million hiring 100 of the world's authorities on human perception and performance to decide how do we build these super cockpits? How do we get this bandwidth to and from the brain? So we knew a lot, and it wasn't really out there. And I wanted to get it out there. So I started this laboratory. But I realized that no one really knew what virtual interfaces were like, virtual reality. So I started working on new displays to do that. This is one of my patents that came out in '92. This was a personal eyewear display. So what you would do is put this on your head. It was what we call an eye multiplex display. You can see the normal world out there, and you look in a little area, and you see this virtual image. It was about 20-degree field of view. And so here you can put this on with a little battery pack and television receiver. That's when actually television was broadcast. And you could watch Oprah while you're walking around. Why you'd ever want to do that, I'm not sure, but you could do it. Or you could watch the NFL playoffs while you're sitting on Waikiki Beach. Nevertheless, that was the idea. And as it turns out, we introduced this into the marketplace as the first consumer virtual reality device that could be bought by anyone. But as it turns out, it was a disaster in the marketplace because who wants to watch Oprah while they're walking around at Waikiki Beach. And the other thing was, it just was too expensive at the time. It was $799. So as it turns out, it was a financial disaster from that standpoint, but we found these markets, these vertical markets, that started picking up on this. Dentists started buying these things like crazy. What were they doing with it? They were giving it to the patients. The patients were in their chair, while the dentists were inflicting pain on them, and they were zoned out watching a movie. So they'd pick their movie and they would play this. Well, then what happened was, of course, it was remarkable because the doctors, the dentists said, gee, the patients aren't complaining anymore. And also, but it caused another set of problems. Now they couldn't get the patients to leave. They said, I can't leave now. This is the good part. But even more remarkable than that is what happened with the little patients. So here you see a little girl with the headset on and playing Nintendo. And it was transformational. The dentists had no complaints and fear from the children. They were able to go in and do their things. And now the kids said, Mommy, when can I go back to the dentist again and play that neat headset and game? Now, that's remarkable. That's transformational. And that led us to a bunch of other things, a whole new way of dealing with pain. Hunter Hoffman, a colleague of mine at the HITlab and at the University of Washington, started investigating this further. And we found that, gee, people that are suffering from burn pain in a burn clinic, just excruciating pain, especially when you do wound care, if you put them in a virtual world while you do that wound care, they don't notice it. At least they don't notice it as much. And instead of dosing them with morphine, you don't even have to dose them with anything. They basically are there in a virtual world, in snow world, and are able to get through this. And then you ask them, well, what is your pain index? And they said, well, when are you going to start? And when in fact you'd already finished the procedure. Well, we knew that television numbed the mind. Well, we know for sure now. This is a proof of that. So as it turns out, we were way too early. And as the new technology came along, especially DVDs and things like that, Sony started picking up on the Glastron. Imagine, I think Imagine's here. Imagine sort of picked up on some of the things that they were doing. And then finally, MyView took what I had in my original personal eyewear display and could sell it for $199. And then, of course, the Google Eye. And a lot of the patents that are being used by Google and these people really came originally from that work, that early work at the HITlab. Now, it turns out this wasn't good enough. I realized that, we were still restricted to the number of picture elements we could get on this really small screen. And what we needed is a paradigm shift in terms of the way we get photons to the retina. So, what about just writing the photons directly on the retina? And this is the virtual retinal display. And instead of taking an array of pixels that you see here on the left, I think it's your left, yeah, what you do is actually project a small, very low energy laser beam and scan it and modulate at the same time, directly on the retina. There's no intermediate image, it's directly on the retina of the eye. This too became transformational because it was both a VR and an AR display. The idea was to see through it. The fact that we're using lasers, even though really, really low energy lasers, this gave us luminance, saturation, and field of view that you never could get and still can't get with any other technologies out there today. But my patent's expired, so you can go take it, use it whatever way you want to. So, but one of the things that happened in the process of doing this was that one day, and this is talks about serendipity, one day this guy comes in the lab and says, I want to see this virtual retinal display. And we said, okay, we took him down to the lab, we had a monocular display set up, and we said, just look in here, and he did, and he looked at it and said, wow, that's really good. And we said, well, take off your spectacles, because you really don't need your spectacles. And he was looking in there, and he said, yeah, it's just as clear without my spectacles, because we really aren't using the optics of the eye. And then on his own, he happened to look in the other eye, and he said, wait a minute, I can see this with my blind eye. And we said, what? He says, I'm blind in my left eye, and I can see the image. And we said, oh yeah? And so that sent us on an entirely different journey. So we started working with the National Eye Institute and the Department of Ophthalmology, and we're getting patients coming in with keratoconus and cataracts and other things like that, even age-related macular degeneration. It was remarkable how we're able to couple these photons into the receptors of the retina. So that became one of those serendipity things. Then we went on to do modulating the light wavefront to create a true three-dimensional display where the voxels were in the right distance from an accommodative standpoint as well as a stereographic standpoint. And this has led to what you heard as Magic Leap. Magic Leap is using the waveform technology, the wavefront light waveguide technology that we basically developed here. Now, in all of this, one of the things we discovered is the power of what we've done. It's like splitting the atom. We're releasing an enormous energy because being there transforms everything. It's like writing on the brain with indelible ink. You never forget it. If it's done right, you never forget it. And we have a great responsibility of what are we going to write on the brain, because it's different now with this great power that we have. And that sort of leads me to this other thinking that we need to be going into. Now, I want to introduce now another person. You probably don't even recognize this guy. He shows up on my doorstep at the HITlab. His name is Mark Billinghurst. He's Kiwi. You know, what do Kiwis know, you know? And so Mark shows up and he has his master's in physics and he wants to do a PhD with me in electrical engineering. And so that began another journey. And of course he was joined in a lab. Hiro Kato shows up and they come up with this augmented reality, video-based augmented reality system. And you've seen these photos before. You've heard Mark speak today or a few days ago. And so this became a transformational thing too. So Mark and I and Hiro started a company called ARToolworks. And would take the open source ARToolkit that we had released, about 100,000 downloads, and now turn that into a product that people can use for various commercial applications. So as it turns out, as you know now, ARToolworks Inc. has been acquired by DAQRI. Here are the original pioneers. You know, Phil Lamb, who is the CTO, Vin Vaughn, who is the CEO of ARToolworks. Here I am. I'm not sure what my purpose was, but here's Mark and Hiro. And so this is wonderful because now DAQRI is taking this and making it open source, which is what it needs to be. So everybody can take advantage and build on it. So we're excited about that and where that will lead. So in addition to this lab now in US, there were other spin-off labs in New Zealand and Australia, and we're looking for others in China and Europe. So the idea is to bring kids together, multidisciplinary, not just in computer science, not just in engineering, but art, drama, and music, and oceans and fisheries, and all of these, because that's where the magic happens, is this cross-disciplinary way of doing things. So there are lots of pioneers. I'm not the only one that's been doing this. Been lots of cool people throughout the years that I've worked with. I love them. And I've learned more from them than they probably ever learned from me. And you're going to have, in a few minutes, you're going to hear from Steve Mann. And oh, what a show it's going to be. I'm just the warm-up act for this. I really do love Steve and what he's done. And you see the other folks here that are just been amazing throughout the years. So if you are interested in a sort of a longer history of, or more in-depth history of those early days of VR, check out this book. This is pretty cool. It's by Ben Delaney. He was the editor of Cyber Age Journal. He had all this record of what was going on. And this book is amazing, at least for an old guy like me who was there when this was all happening. Sex, Drugs, and Tessellation. The title sort of can stimulate you to what's to follow. Now, in summary, I believe that in looking over my career, you know, things actually used to be easier. When we were sailing along, we had a nice breeze. We could see the destination. We knew where we were going. Things were sort of calm, and we were getting there, making progress. But something happened in the middle of this. We sort of went into this VR winter time period. This is when, you know, it was overhyped, all this kind of thing. And so we didn't have a lot of breeze blowing. But we got out our oars and rowed anyway. And a lot of the things that you see, like the ARToolkit and things like that, came during that time in the virtual retinal display. But now I think we're at a different point. Right now, today, you know, it's different kind of sailing. And it's like we can't see the horizon anymore. We don't know what the destination is. It's like we can't shoot the stars to know where we are. And the question is, how in the world do we navigate in this world when we can't see the horizon and we can't see the stars or we can't see the sun necessarily to guide us? And what kind of maps? What are our destinations going to be? We have this embarrassment of riches of technology. We're intoxicated by it, intoxicated by technology. And technology is taking the lead. And that's why I say we can no longer look to a future because we're in it right now. Kurzweil was right. The singularity has happened. Now, the fabric of our whole society, things are changing so fast, we just have to be, because we don't know what the future is going to lead to, really. So we have to be it now. So we need a new kind of navigation tool. We need what we call the Nextant. The Nextant is the next sextant that's going to help us to do that. And what we have to do is transform the way we've been doing things in the past. Here's the old way, where we took the foundational science and all this enabling technology it gave us, and we're building these things and trying to stuff it down into applications. Now, it's good to see some applications emerging, because we need to have, along with this technology push, we need to have the pull. And so the questions we have to ask with using our Nextant is what if, so what, and why not? So we want to transform this equation and actually now look at the bottom here, those societal drivers. What are the pulls? What are the real pulls? And how do we now connect the dots? Because those pulls will give us markets and consumers. And then if we jump in the middle and say, what if we could do this? And then we say, so what? By tracking it down to those societal drivers, we'll have something that's sustainable and, by the way, helps the world. But the other thing is, why not? And that's when we jump in and build that last bridge of those concept demonstrations that prove that we can do it. If you're able to do that, then the money will flow, the opportunities will flow, and not only that, you'll get these bennies for feeling like you're doing a good thing in the world. Okay, so I'm about out of time here. Just let me go through a few pulls here of my heart. I'm really out of time, aren't I? And so these are the things that pull on me. You'll have your own, but there's this pull of what's going on in the world with all the orphans, 13 million plus, because of AIDS. And all these people, these children are dying every minute because they're starving. Here we are. Look at us. In other parts of the world, people are dying. Kids are dying. We ought to do something about that. We're responsible. We've been blessed with this. Not only that, look what we're doing with our young people. They're coming back home in boxes, not only in this land, but other lands. War is so dumb. I mean, I used to be a warrior. I don't want to ever do that again. We've got to figure out a better way of solving those problems. And then there's the pulls of the earth. Look at this, the Arctic wilderness. Guess what we're going to do there? We're going to take this beautiful place and we'll put oil wells there. And we'll suck the earth, the fossil fuels out of the earth, so we can do this. Doesn't make any sense at all. We are making some advances, mind you, but we still have a long way to go. And then what about the people? What about my mother? My mother passed away 2 years ago, but what a wonderful woman she was. What a great life she had and still could give. But she was thrown away. We throw away our old people when in fact they have marvelous stories and marvelous experiences they can share. We're not tapping a great treasure that we have. And then my grandchildren. What kind of world am I going to lead for them? We have to be responsible for those things. Now finally, I believe that we need to get into this awakening of what's going on with our kids. That's another treasure. This lad sitting in classroom can't wait to get home to play Grand Theft Auto. That's where he's spending his cycles. That's where his interest is. How can we tap that? And how can we go in families and get them to look up from the screens and see each other, or at least to go into worlds together and help solve problems? These are things that I would love to do and want to, at the same time, help especially the new adventurers in this world to understand that there are really rocks and shoals out there, and that we know, we've been there, and we want to relate that to you. How are we going to do that? Well, my dream is to resurrect something I started in the 90s called the Virtual World Society. This is what I want to do, the gift to this community. And what it is a community of these pioneers and latter-day art adventurers that where together we'll explore and guide this, where VR and AR is going, especially from the applications pull standpoint, to solve these pervasive problems. Go online, see virtualworldsociety.org. And so it's going to bring together these folks. We want to link to the AW and the IEEE and build a collaborative space and especially solve some problems. And you'll see that we're going to be asking you questions about some of these pervasive problems you think we ought to be working on. So go to the virtualworldsociety.org and log in and do this survey so we can find out what you think, because this is really for you and for all of us to join together. We want to have these kinds of forums as well, but we also need something beyond that, especially we can tap the kids and get them involved. And volunteer to help. So you'll be hearing more of this, and hopefully we'll be talking about it in future conferences. I want to thank Chris Stapleton. Chris is this marvelous, inventive guy. I love him. And yes, Chris is, it's been a lot of the stimulation for me. And so I love this guy, and thanks, Chris, for that help. This is an exciting time. You know, I'm sort of showing these things that probably the world's sort of going to hell in a handbasket, but really, it's an exciting time. What other time would it be more fun to be alive? That wind is blowing. Yes, there's a high sea state, but that Nextant, you know what the Nextant is? It's your heart. That's where the stars are. That's what will guide us in our own hearts. But we need to look up and look around and see what's happening in the world and let our heart grab those things and use them to pull us along, pull this technology along. Yeah, we have to have the technology, but we want to pull it into these applications and configure it and solve those problems, because that in the end is the end game that we should be playing. Thank you very much. My time is out. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Take this. We are out of time, but I can't let Tom, just wait 1 second. Let Tom go without at least one audience question. So I'm going to sneak it in. So who's the lucky person that's going to take one question? Raise your hand. Let's do this one right here. And Steve Mann's up next.
Actually, 2 questions. I'd love...
Oh, let's make it one, just to be fair.
All right.
Yeah.
The thread between your work and Magic Leap, can you describe that a little more? Thank you.
Probably not. Just suffice it to say that if you look at the virtual retinal display patent, go in there and dig into it, and you'll see that one of the ways that we were planning to steer the beam around is electronically, and to do that with a phased array of lasers. There's some cool things you can do with lasers when you use a phased array. So one of the things you can do is project black. And just suffice it to say that there's some nice things that lasers can do when you have light interfering with a light. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.